Welcome back to my disembodied voice. Now, human beings are naturally inclined to assess one another rapidly. This instinctive process of forming first impressions is shaped by a variety of factors, including appearance, the way someone speaks, physical attractiveness, and the overall demeanour of who we're interacting with. And given this enduring nature of first impressions, it's crucial when we are reading a book, watching a movie, or just starting a TV show, because our initial feelings will decide if we're going to persevere and invest our time in this new project. And despite it hardly being an arduous task, sitting on our bums and watching something on our TV or phone, the sheer amount of content these days means that our time is precious and not something we can waste easily, because between work, kids, friends, social life, sleep, and whatever else you like to do, that little bit of time that we get to unwind, catch up, put ourselves in front of a program and invest in something truly is a precious thing, and all of these companies know that keeping someone's attention in the modern day world isn't easy. So, by being conscious of this, it's imperative that when trying to hook someone into a show or engage them in a movie, the first impression matters because of the psychology about how we instantly make judgments about things. And these judgments stay with us, despite the rest of the movie giving us the story, and we often remember how characters are introduced and how great scenes stay with us forever and are immortalised in history purely from that moment when something is introduced, first shown, first shocks us, first makes us go, oh wow. Now, psychologists call this thin slicing, and it's when we quickly judge others based on brief interactions. The amygdala in the brain instantly assesses traits like safety and likability, while the prefrontal cortex later refines these judgments into something more concrete. As a result, we often form impressions before someone speaks, and we get this from things like appearance. Clothing and physical features are amongst the first things noticed. Then facial expressions also play a role. Smiling, for instance, or grimacing. Smiling especially makes someone appear more approachable. And even things like basic colours have a psychological impact, as darker shades can signal authority, whilst lighter hues may evoke friendliness. There's also things like attractiveness, deformity, facial tics, things like a lack of blinking, and body language is also a big factor, as we see from the first sign that someone is either imposing, bored, angry, and as I've said in this channel before, our brains make a judgment about somebody in about 0.7 seconds of first laying eyes on them. Tone and speech also play a part, so gravitas of voice is a major factor, but if the villain doesn't speak, then the context of the environment plays a huge part, as things like being in space, in the ocean, or even standing in a prison cell all add to the mood and tension that's being evoked. And there is also our subjective and conscious biases, which help us inform our opinions, as someone who's a victim of assault might view a fairly innocuous mannerism from a stranger as threatening, and sometimes merely being a male around someone like a female can make someone suspicious due to a history of pain and trauma. So, for villains needing a great intro and hitting hard, for today's video, let's look at great antagonists or monsters and decipher just how their initial impressions shaped the movie that was to follow and why they're so memorable. Now, as ever, let me climb the crow's nest and shout, spoilers ahoy, for any movie or TV show we discuss today. And in terms of a flow-through chart, we're going to look at 7 different types of introductions and see how these set the scene and imprint on our memories. Now, this is going to take 2 videos in total, as it's going to be a long dive into this. So for the 7 introductions we're going to do, we will cover 4 today and 3 next time. And our entire flow-through chart is the hidden monster, the crime scene, the powerful tyrant, the caged beast, the POV, the full face, the behemoth. Right then, let's crack on. Okay, so let's get straight into this one and start with the hidden monster. The movie asks us to use our imagination as the size, power, ferocity and horror is explicitly hinted at, but without showing us the whole creature, our subjective creativity fills in the gaps. And perhaps no movie has done the whole hidden monster best than the 1975 classic Jaws. Now, Spielberg had problems with the mechanical shark, and that's well known, and that's why it was off screen for large periods of time. But even from the opening scene, the idea of using the darkness and the ocean as cover, and also showing glimpses from underneath the ocean and on top of the ocean, slicing in half the underside underworld and the normal humanised top of it, was a stroke of genius. And seeing poor Chrissy Watkins getting ripped to pieces by something powerful below the water is one of the most intense scenes in cinema history. Now, horror films immerse us in darkness, giving us the chance to confront predatory threats in the controlled environment of our homes, as we know, deep down, that sharks are not monsters, but just very efficient predators, and we don't really belong in their watery world when they're hunting. However, the great fish, as Peter Benchley describes it, ends up being a truly oversized and monstrous great white and is 25 feet long and ends up eating its way through a small collection of Amity bathers and boats. But for the opening scene, with the music, thrashing, screaming and eventual drag under the water, it rocks us to the core and stays with us because it triggers so many parts of the brain from the sight and sounds that we are imbued with. Our amygdala, the almond-shaped structure deep within the brain, is highly activated when confronted with scenes of immediate danger, fear and panic. And our internal alarm system, that the amygdala sets off, processes the shocking audio-visual input from the film and triggers the fight or flight response and releases cortisol and adrenaline, which increases our heart rates. And even though we're not in danger and we're watching it safely on a chair and we know it's a film, the girl is being ripped to pieces by something that's no ordinary shark. It's shocking, it's ferocious, and because we can't see what's happening underneath, parts of our brains work alongside the amygdala, so the imaginative parts of our brain, to create this truly what's going on underneath, this must be horrific, and filling in the blanks. And the revulsion from all that screaming is down to the insular cortex, which is responsible for processing feelings such as fear and revulsion. And this is triggered into action by the violent imagery and sounds during the attack. Now, the insular cortex gives rise to that familiar pit in your stomach sensation, reflecting the body's entire reaction. And, as we know, the brain does one thing and the body reacts. And the purpose of fight or flight is to push blood to the limbs, increase digestion, suppress insulin, and get you ready for action. And seeing another human struggle, like Chrissy does in the water, activates this sense and this mode, and it sets you off. And even though you're not going to run, you sense danger, we empathise with danger, and we understand what this is, and our pulses go up. The auditory and visual cortices are strongly triggered by rapid editing, the dark water, the visuals, and John Williams' ominous swelling score as something heads towards Chrissy's naked legs. Then, sudden screams and dramatic changes in visuals create similar activation patterns in these areas for the viewer, and it's a phenomenon known as high intersubject correlation. And while the amygdala first responds to fear, the prefrontal cortex tries to regulate this response by reminding the viewer that they're safe, whether they're in a theatre or watching it at home. However, the most effective horror scenes, the ones that set off the amygdala's fear response, often overwhelms this rational thinking part of the brain. Now, I often talk about limbic brain thinking, which is the reptilian and primal parts of the brain, and then there is the other side of it, which is the frontal lobe rational thinking that humans use so well, most of the time. And being so close to Chrissy in the water as she fights for her life, we are both alarmed and frightened, but also deeply involved and therefore drawn into the scene. we're alarmed and left with a physical response, a mental response, and because we cannot see what is causing the carnage, we have a missing piece of visual information that we have to fill in ourselves. And that's why we remember the scenes so well. No shark is present at all in the opening scenes, and although we all know what a shark looks like, and we know a shark is doing this, we are just dealing with the reaction, the screams, and the terror as she looks down, begs, screams, all whilst getting ragdolled in the water by something truly powerful. Often copied, the unseen monster is a great way to build tension, and in Jaws, when the shark is revealed in the estuary scene where it chomps on the poor boater, the reveal is a rare match to the imagination that we had early on. You'll never forget Jaws after watching it for the first time, and the scene with Chrissy Watkins sticks in our hippocampus memory centre forever, and we will always remember the music, the sights, the sounds, the build-up. It's truly brilliant and memorable. So that's the hidden monster. But when it comes to humans, we can also be monsters, but in a different way. We are monstrous, we act in monstrous ways, and when we are in the real world psychological thriller and we're removing the supernatural from the story, how do you introduce an antagonist and make them scary? Well, like the shark in Jaws, we're going to keep the person hidden, and for a deeper effect, rather than seeing the victim fight a point of view killer, we'll come to that later in the next video, we will enter the aftermath and get a private tour around the crime scene. The brutality is done, and we are now privy to the police dissection and first forensic analysis, allowing us in on the crime and asking us to use both our imaginations and reality-based rational parts of our brain to picture the killer and the victim's ordeal. A villain needs to stay with you, and sometimes killers are just people, bland, ordinary people. In fact, the Yorkshire Ripper, Peter Sutcliffe, when he was taken to court and tried for his crimes, the judge called him the most unremarkable man he had ever met. He wasn't a bodybuilder like Bane or a cackling cartoonish villain like the Joker. In real life, he was a dull as dishwater everyday bloke. And in the movie Seven, John Doe is exactly that. A dry, dull, uninspiring person, and quite anticlimactic to his crimes. Doe even says, "There's nothing special about me. I've never been exceptional," harking to that kind of averageness of him, that nothingness, bland, banal male. And that's the point. We are always wary of Doe, no matter the numbers of police, the guns, or the shackles he's constrained in. And that's because we've seen 5 crime scenes which detail who he is and what he is capable of without ever showing his face. Well, apart from the journalist photography on the stairs, but that's a deliberate red herring early on. Doe has force-fed a man to death, made another man mutilate himself to death, kept another man restrained in bed for a year, forced another man to stab a woman to death with a bladed strap-on, and made a young girl overdose before then cutting off her nose to spite her face. Now, we've seen glimpses of Doe, like I said, the fake journalist, and of course the chase in his apartment block, but his crimes are so outrageous, so far-fetched, and as we go through the crime scene, rather than seeing them happen, we are building up intrigue and mystery. Doe's late introduction is not just designed to finally reveal the big bad, but also to challenge the viewer's expectations by using fear, dread, and fascination to make the villain the most compelling part of the film. This killer cannot just shoot people, he needs to be the reason we are hooked as the mystery unfolds. He needs a mantra, in this case 7 deadly sins, and we become voyeurs into a police investigation, and the imaginative crime scenes add weight and gravitas to villainous characters like John Doe. And his opening kill, the gluttony death scene, shows us someone who is a sadist, but on top of their evil proclivities, they are calm enough to go to the store to buy more spaghetti to keep the murder scene going. The paradox of that calmness and evil, which causes a dissonance in our minds and shows us someone who is calculating as well as cruel, is the splinter which stays in our memories. As Morgan Freeman even states, he isn't a lunatic, Don't dismiss him as wacko. John Doe is a genius and methodical, and he's also intelligent and brilliant. He's built up to be this incredibly complex, almost subhuman, absolutely supernatural killer, when of course he's just a man. Seven has all the grime and dirt of a real-life purgatory. It's a cesspool city of no hope, which matches its killer's hatred of sin, but going back to Peter Sutcliffe again, like in the ITV drama The Long Shadow, here we always see the aftermath of the crimes, where everything we gather is cerebral and it's not diluted by watching him torture someone or be present in the scenes. We're always too late, catching up. We're just as in the dark as the police investigating him are. We are told about the stabbings in detail. We attend the autopsies and see how the victims suffered. We even attend the crime scene and see the corpse. And, as imagination, like in The Unseen Monster, is a powerful thing, our brains fill in the blanks, the screams, the sheer hour of torture, the brutality, and, unlike Chrissy in Jaws, where we don't see the shark, but we see her dying in agony, the crime scene allows us to dissect, pick over the bones and indulge morbid fascination, and this gives us as much or as little imagination as we possess and elevates the film. The killer isn't shown to us directly, he's instead built up by a footprint. We don't even see people fighting an unseen force or a POV, we just see the aftermath, a set of clues, and we are right there solving the case too, allowing our imagination to go to war with the logical parts of our brain as we ponder the horror and piece together logic. And that's what makes Seven such a brilliant movie and Doe such a memorable villain. Anyway, let's move on and come to The Powerful Tyrant. This villain is all about strength. So we need to see the sheer brutality in the opening scene so we comprehend just how little hope the protagonist has against such an unstoppable force. Now, in the movie The Avengers are very strong. And despite being scattered across the world and space by the time of Infinity War, we have the son of Odin, a god by all accounts, a monstrous Hulk, a billionaire genius, a super soldier, a witch who knows magic, a sorcerer who protects the Time Stone, and many other great heroes. So what kind of threat is going to cause them to be in trouble? Well, in Thanos, we have a cosmic being who can wear infinity stones like something from Claire's accessories and has immense strength. In his opening scene, he is about to kill Thor with the Power Stone, and then he beats the unstoppable Hulk half to death without breaking a sweat. This powerful display from Thanos shows complete control and competence. Our respect for him is earned by a demonstration of strength and sadism. And this creates the psychological imprint of respect and admiration as the audience wonders how the hero can win against such an immovable and indestructible object, and also power. We see just how powerful he is and how he's going to outmatch many of the Avengers. Also, Thanos remains very calm throughout all of this, monologuing, absorbing the power of the stone, then calmly killing Loki before deciding it's time to head elsewhere and get more of the Infinity Stones. Now, our brains perceive strength in certain ways, and that's why an introduction like Thanos is so clever and memorable. You see, we know our heroes have morals, and with great power comes great responsibility. However, our brains also interpret villains as possessing greater power than the heroes due to largely an absence of moral boundaries and the missing of an inner compass. Villains are not hindered by societal rules, guilt, or ethics, and this enables them to act without restriction. And this lack of restraint allows for a perception of strength and dominance as they pursue their objectives with a single-minded determination, and when we mix in size, muscles, and the magic of some mystery stones, we see the limitations the heroes are going to have due to the fact that they are bound by different rules, and this power supersedes their own. Villains are also highly efficient and are solely focused on achieving their goals, irrespective of the morality. They're not going to break mid-fight to save someone or approach something differently because there might be casualties. They're just going to do whatever they want and to hell with it. And this results-driven approach is processed by our brains as a sign of proactivity and control by the villain. In contrast, heroes often face internal conflicts and moral dilemmas which can impede their effectiveness. And villains frequently exhibit a high degree of self-assurance, stemming from an absence of inner turmoil. And again, for many heroes' journey, it's that existential struggle which defines them and creates who they are. And this overconfidence in villains is perceived as strength, capturing the audience's attention and reinforcing their formidable presence. Now, Thanos has a philosophy, and a very clear philosophy, and this is crucial because we engage with the narrative and use something in neuroscience called mirror neurons, which are activated when the individuals observe actions or emotions in others, creating a sense of emotional mirroring. This mechanism allows viewers to experience a fraction of the feelings exhibited by other characters, deepening the engagement with the narrative of the story and thus enabling us to understand even if we don't agree. And this means we can empathise with them too, even if we don't agree, as we can hold two ideals at the same time. We can see that the world is draining of resources and there does need to be some changes. However, we don't necessarily agree with Thanos saying, "I'll just kill 50% of all life." And this is exhibited in Infinity War when Thanos meets Gamora and he kills half the population, with Gamora's back turned to the horror, and we again are involved in the dissonance of vicariously experiencing forbidden behaviours and repressed emotions, such as difficult choices, such as far-fetched violence on a massive scale. Like I said, we don't have to agree with it, but we've all had opinions at times in capital punishment, what we should do with things like child molesters, what we should do with people who kill, what we should do to try and get behaviour and respect more in society. Everyone's got those views, everyone's got their own ideals of what the world could be if it was a better place, if they could enact these things. And so by watching it on screen, like I say, we don't have to agree with what Thanos is doing, but we can see a method to his madness. So, watching Thanos, we see his sense of power as both a compelling and liberating philosophy. And that comes from knowing that resources are finite in worlds, and we understand his mission to snap half of everything away so things can last longer, but also we can see the disgust in his methods and have a fear of his narcissism and casual sadism as he goes about his work, as we know that if it was happening on Earth, our most beloved child or beloved partner could just turn to dust out the blue, and that adds a horror to the element. Thanos has his children, Ebony Maw and the gang, and despite being brutal and magical, they also bow down to him, fear him, and admire him. And after he ragdolls the Hulk and kills Loki and then almost ruins Thor, we are left in no mind that, despite saving the world previously, the Avengers are not going to have an easy time against this guy. And it's possibly why the comic book movies are in such a bad state right now, as, apart from all the identity politics and terrible scripts and quite poor visual effects at the moment, there is no fear of strength, conviction or resilience in modern villains, and we now have overpowered heroes and very lacklustre villains. Finally, in part 1 of this villain introduction video, we come to the Caged Beast. This monster is contained and secured, but the overkill confinement and threat of escape creates a fear of them getting out, and this must always remain present. Otherwise, we just have a human in a cell. And what better example than Silence of the Lambs, who gave us Dr. Hannibal Lecter, who is now an icon of movie history. However, his introduction to the world was crucial in keeping the fear, maintaining a sense of threat, and adding menace to the film, as back in 1991 we hadn't had the awful Hannibal, we hadn't had the remake of Manhunter, as the book was initially titled Red Dragon, so was the later film, and so when we were introduced to a man in a perspex cell who was of average height, average build, he was just a man. So how did the film introduce this man and make him so immortal in our minds? Well, firstly, there is the build-up, the visual cues of descending deep into a basement of hell itself, as Chilton takes Clarice from the light of the upper world into the depths of a hellish basement which narrows and darkens, and the corridors get even more narrowed, and it gets more and more red and black in the shades of the colour as we descend towards where Hannibal is kept. Then we get the description and a photo that we can't see, again using our imagination, of his pulse rate never went above 85, even as he ate her tongue. And we see Clarice's face as she looks into it and thinks, what on earth am I going to see? And then, when the final cage door slams shut and Clarice walks down the dark corridor, she bypasses lunatics, men who are just rocking backwards and forwards, screaming, masturbating. And at the end of it, we come to an odd gentlemanly male who has pleasant manners and doesn't have bars, just this bizarre perspex front. We know why. You can't approach. He's a cannibal. He bites. And it adds to the overall atmosphere and terror. Now, Dr. Lecter stands out among fictional antagonists due to his remarkable intellectual prowess. He is presented to the viewer under an overkill of description and security, but when we meet him, he's calm, quiet, and as we learn from the intro and his perspective, he's a psychiatrist of exceptional brilliance who not only possesses a deep understanding of the human mind, but also an appreciation for art, music, and fine cuisine. And this juxtaposition between his cultured tastes and the horrific nature of his crimes creates a compelling contrast, heightening the complexity of his character and once again asking us to hold two ideals at the same time. A genius, culture-loving man who's also a tongue-eating monster who would kill rather than look at you. And one of the most unsettling aspects of Lecter's persona is his calm and composed demeanour throughout. Regardless of the situation's intensity or disturbance, he maintains an unflappable calmness, never raising his voice and never losing control. Now, as I've discussed on this channel before, psychopaths are resistant to chaos and have an unnerving method of remaining calm at all times. And Lecter possesses an uncanny skill to read people, identifying their vulnerabilities and exploiting them to his advantage. And this manipulative talent is especially evident in his first interaction with Clarice Starling, where he expertly teases out her desires and weaknesses. And the resulting cat and mouse dynamic between these two enriches the film's narrative, solidifying Lecter's place as one of the most engaging figures in psychological thriller history. However, in the opening scene, he goes between sly calmness and then a quick burst of ferocious hissing, such as the Chianti and Fava Bean speech, but this is done to kind of exert his dominance. He's not losing control or losing his temper, he's just telling her that all of this loveliness that she's currently seeing, all this calmness, can change very quickly as he hisses and lets her know what's behind the mask. And yes, at the end of the scene, he does call Clarice back with a very animated, loud voice, but that's because Clarice has had something rather unpleasant flung in her face, and Dr. Lecter does not tolerate discourtesy. Even in his most loud outburst, where he must vociferously proclaim his anger, it's over something which is a complete paradox, which is, how dare the man next door do that to a young lady who was polite to him? How dare he? And therefore, she earns her first crumb on the trail of clues. So what have we learnt so far? Well, the most effective method for introducing a villain is to show them succeeding in an act that demonstrates their skill and power. The shark in Jaws eats Chrissy with ease. Thanos beats Hulk to a pulp, and we see that John Doe has tortured a man to death in what appears to be a very prolonged session of cruelty. And for Hannibal, he intimidates Clarice and flicks between calm and what's behind the mask, and it shows us just how dangerous and manipulative this man really is and why that cell door needs to stay locked and sealed. Hannibal is a visible paradox of cannibalistic psychopathy and fine art loving culture. His moods, be they calm or hissing, are the same as his mental state. They flit between the two, and we are not quite sure what we're getting or what we should trust. He's a cold-blooded psychopath and a fine wine-loving connoisseur. And this approach immediately establishes the threat he poses, and for all of our villains, the danger and the menace that is there. And as our fight or flight system goes on edge, we suddenly realise where we are and what we're dealing with, be it a caged monster, a giant shark, a megalomaniacal god, or a twisted serial killer. So, as we close part 1 of this video essay, we can see that engagement with villains involves a complex interplay of our brain regions. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex regulates the emotional response and maintains attention, whilst the default mode network is crucial for self-referential and thought. And these neural mechanisms underpin the immersive experience of narrative involvement. We have the frontal lobe rational part of the prefrontal cortex, which thinks, and then the amygdala and limbic backbrain section, which is all about fear, alarm and adrenaline. And a well-crafted and well-introduced villain creates cognitive conflict by affecting both regions, and this engages the brain to navigate complex stories, terrifying situations, impactful moments, empty rooms and aftermaths, and helps sustain interest and prolong emotional investment in a memorable villain. It helps us support 2 opposing narratives at the same time. It helps us understand just what we're dealing with, and it makes us feel viscerally what could happen if we got in the water, if the cell door was removed, if we were left alone with John Doe. And as the saying goes, you never get a second chance to make a first impression, and for great villains, we're given shock and awe, build-up and payoff immediately, and the stakes are laid out early on, so we, the audiences, are fully aware of the power, fear, threat and danger, and now we are going to have to see how the protagonist is going to somehow catch this shark, stop this monster, find this serial killer, or try and contain this complete maniac. Anyway, that's it for this week's video. So remember that psychology is cool.
So cool.
Please like, share and subscribe, as more subs means more vids, and even leave a comment or start a discussion, as healthy debate is always welcome on here. And as ever, until next time, I'll catch you later.